Francois, and it's actually Carol Seeger's Francois. I grew up in Johnstown. I now live in Dallas, Texas. When I first heard of Cody's book, I knew right away that my company needed to get involved in sponsoring and planning this event. And so it's almost as hot here as it was in Dallas when I left. But it's well worth it to experience this heat. As Clyde pointed out, we've been planning this program for over a year, and we're just happy to see the turnout here tonight. I'm also happy to see a number of people that I've known all my life and grown up with or went to school with, and I'm glad that you're here to hear this presentation. Cody, I want to thank you for your insight into the banishment that happened here in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. I grew up here, as I said, I'm a Johnstowner, and did not know of that incident until about, 2020 when you wrote your book.
Yeah.
And so I would expect that if I didn't know anything about it, not that I know everything, but I can imagine there are a lot of people in Johnstown that did not know this. So I appreciate your delving into it and keeping the story alive, because this is history that must be known. A lot of you probably know that I'm an educator and spent many years in the classroom. So you're going to have to put up with hearing it from a writer right now. I'd like to frame our panel discussion within the context of a quote by the writer James Baldwin. Baldwin said, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and in many ways, history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where he or she is and formed one's point of view. Again, not having known this history, it is very important as I listen and share with you that quote by Baldwin, that really we may not understand how we have been shaped by the history that Cody shared with us, whether you knew it or not. Your history has been impacted by something that happened 100 years ago. So in commemorating this incident, we have to realize that we are actually commemorating a piece and a parcel of ourselves. Now, I'm going to ask Cody, we've had some other instances, and I know you talked about instances in Pennsylvania, but keep in mind that in 1919, there was an outbreak of racial violence known as the Red Summer that affected Black citizens in at least 27 cities across the United States. And that violence, which continued well into the 1920s, with the infamous event that most of us know of as the Tulsa Massacre in 1922, included all types of domestic terrorism, lynchings, murders, banishments, neighborhoods wiped out like Rosedale, and property and land theft. And I appreciate the fact, Cody, that you talked about how and what can be done if you have a history and know that land was taken from you or your family. So you talked about some other instances of banishment based on race or national origin in Pennsylvania that happened. Were any of these as serious or as well, they're all serious, but as impactful as what happened in Johnstown?
I think what makes Johnstown unique as a story, and it's hard to stretch, like for instance, the Stowe Township one, I can't really stretch into a story. This is a very unique instance of racial cleansing because it became a national and international scandal. The fact that Latinos were also involved, there haven't really been that many instances of Mexicans documented where they were forced out of the community this early in history to be this persecuted. And the fact that there was also, the theme for this year's Black History Defiance, correct? The black newspapers were defined, and this is the perfect instance of how black people came to the rescue of their own. A lot of these types of stories, unless there's some sort of a documentation or investigation like I found, are very hard to stretch into a book. Even this work was hard to stretch into a book. But to answer your question, the only instance that I've really researched extensively in Pennsylvania is in Stowe Township. And there are varying reports that say that I think it was 300 to 500, so it wasn't on this scale. And as of right now, the research that we know, I think this is the largest racial cleansing in Pennsylvania history.
While you have the mic, I want to ask you, talk about the KKK. And I recall a quote, I think in your book, you said, a member of the Klan said, we want you to understand, this is a quote, we want you to understand that our demonstration tonight, meaning the burning of the crosses, is not directed toward the law-abiding Negroes of Johnstown. We are after that dirty crew that has been sent into Johnstown, those questionable characters gathered from questionable neighborhoods and other cities, dumped upon Johnstown to stage their drunken revels, their shooting sprees, and their murderous designs. So, obviously, Cody, you've got a KKK member willing to speak out to a newspaper. Were there other instances or situations that involved the Klan in this area that you know of or heard of or heard about?
Yeah, the Klan at the time, the reason it was so successful was because of its publicity strategy. It localized every appeal, but it would also have church invasions where it would go into churches and then ostentatiously hand money in to show that they were charitable. And then if they had burnings, they would invite reporters to come up and cover the burnings. And there's a famous, I think I included this photo in the presentation in the Johnstown Tribune, where it described them almost as cultish, where it was really creepy, as it always is, of them burning a cross. And so, yeah, I mean, they weren't covered, if you cover a newspaper, if you read journalistic history, the coverage of the Klan in the 20s was covered more as a civic organization that was membered by respectable people in society, whereas if you do in the 60s, it's covered as a terrorist organization. And that's whenever the coverage started being more accurate about what their motives and actions were truly like. But I think the Klan's behavior in Pennsylvania, say for instance, was a lot different than in Mississippi. I traveled to Mississippi actually last year, and in the course of actually some of the coverage that I was doing on my reproductive rights stuff, I kind of encountered some of the white supremacists down there. And it's just, there was a historian at Pines History Center who said he doesn't like to rate or rank racism. But there are certain places, I think, that you go in America where there are just certain things that would happen that they wouldn't happen elsewhere. And I think Mississippi is one of those places. And I think certain parts of Pennsylvania, like the central parts, are probably more historically troubled by racism than, say, Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Though there are some substantial issues in both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as well.
Speaking specifically about racial incidents of terrorism or harm, those kinds of things. There's a difference between systemic racism and that type of racism.
Yeah.
Well, I heard you mention earlier the idea, the concept of the sundown town, and Courtney Square is here. Courtney is a researcher herself, a historian, and my co-host on our podcast, Why Are They So Angry? And Courtney, we did a podcast on sundown towns, so what is your history of it and understanding of what a sundown town is? And would you classify Johnstown as a sundown town?
Well, that's a very compound kind of question, because we always...
Those are the kind of questions I do.
And that's the kind of questions I answer. Do you ever wonder why your town is made up the way it is? Why you don't feel safe going to certain parts of central Pennsylvania or Mississippi? That's by design. Sundown towns are towns that were created exclusively to exclude and remove African Americans and other ethnicities, but mostly African Americans. Reconstruction, which was a glorious dream that did not happen, racial tensions, especially in the North, because of the fear of Black plague coming from the South, began to rouse up different neighborhoods. So through town ordinances, which were illegal, through terror acts, meaning we're going to grab a Black man and make the Black people in town watch us lynch and burn him, so you know not to live here. Signage, ethnic cleansings, and all-out burnings and massacres. So that's how sundown towns are created. They're also very secretive. You don't know why your town is a sundown town. People know, but you're not gonna write that down because that's not good for the Chamber of Commerce brochure that we're a sundown town. Would I say that Johnstown is a sundown town? If the cleansing worked the way that it was supposed to, yes. But for those ancestors and families that were already rooted and grounded in Johnstown, I'm talking about Bethel AME, I'm talking about Cambria AME, those churches and activists in the community. Yes, there's 3.3% African Americans in Johnstown, but to be considered a sundown town, you must have over several decades 1% or less African American population. Fun fact, there are not a lot of sundown towns in the South because Black people were already discriminated against. It didn't matter. The thing in the North was we do not want these people next door to us out of fear.
Now we have a little bit of clarification on the sundown town. And sundown basically meaning when the sun comes down, you, if you're Black or another ethnic group, time for you to leave. You don't let the sun catch you here. So you're here. There's an article, and in fact, I want to encourage everyone when we take when we end the program, and I want to thank one of the individuals who came from the Tribune Democrat and brought some of the newspapers from I think it was a 3 or 4 part article series that was run about the Rosedale situation. And in that, one of those articles, the reporter said, Mayor Joseph Caulfield forever transformed the economic and cultural identity of Johnstown. So that's pretty powerful to change both the culture and the identity of a town. So a bannishman does that. So let's think about 100 years where we are now. 1923, now we're 2023. What impact, and I'm giving this question to both Cody and Courtney, what impact do you think that incident of 100 years ago has actually had on this community today, 2023?
I definitely think we're living in a what could be, because we don't know who was expelled, the artists, the mayors, the activists, the teachers, the students, the potential spouses and families that could have been created. 2,000 people is a lot of people, and we'll never know what could have been birthed from that. So I think we're living in the what could have been, but I'm also proud to say of those of us who remained, the beauty that came out of that as well.
Well, I think last year I spent 2 weeks traveling through the South. So I went through Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. And you see how important, say for instance in Memphis on Beale Street, that music was, or that in Nashville, Music Row is. And things like music itself are an industry in those types of communities. And the Black community is known historically for having great music, so even things like that, there may have been some sort of famous music street in Johnstown that maybe, I'm just doing these hypotheticals, you'd have like a place like Beale Street in Johnstown that would have weathered the steel storm, like the steel mills leaving, and then because there was that culture, it would have attracted investment from tech companies or things like that. And in that book, in Sundown Towns, one of the things that ends up happening to a community that has a racial cleansing of some sort is that it doesn't really weather those economic downturns nearly as well because it doesn't attract investment. It's not as attractive as a place to live because it forces out other people because of discriminatory practices. So yeah, I think all the culture, all the entrepreneurship businesses, as well as other, maybe someone from the black community went on to become a billionaire or something, and then comes back and then starts a company in Johnstown, and those things can happen. And they may not have happened because they may have went elsewhere and brought that money that went to those communities instead.
What could have been, Cody, you said you managed to secure a historical marker to commemorate this incident here in Johnstown, Rosedale. Why do you think it's important, both to you and Courtney, why do you think it's important to have those types of monuments, mementos, remembrances for incidents like this? Why do we need that? We see historical markers all around our town, we see them around the country. What purpose will that serve to have that historical marker about Rosedale? So we'll start with Cody and then to
It's in conjunction with other things. I think the biggest thing that we've done actually here is to get the book in the high school curriculums. They write essays now about this whole incident, and it's influenced the entire generation of Johnstowners now that have come in the last 3 years from high school, and hopefully it remains in the curriculum and does that. But to answer your question, I think things like proclamations, and what I want to do in Pittsburgh, for instance, is I want to get a proclamation from the county executive, as well as a proclamation from the governor to acknowledge the Stowe expulsion, as well as a historical marker for that one. It's important to recognize that these things happen in these communities, and more of these historical markers that are present in each community that it happened in, the more cognizant I think people will be of the challenges that people of color have faced in these communities, and maybe that seeing those signs and reading them will in fact maybe make them better people when they realize that some of the things that have happened in their community should never happen again.
I do. When I was a little girl, and my mom is here right now, and I'd get in trouble after my punishment, she would say, "Well, what did you learn?" I didn't want to say anything, but that's why these things are important, because history is not a romance novel. History is a witness of our best and of our worst, and what we want to be, and where we want to strive to be, and who we never want to be again. So yes, it may seem performative to get a plaque or a proclamation, but if one person remembers, not in my town, not to my neighbors, not to my coworkers, that in itself is us triumphing over what happened 100 years ago right now.
And I'm going to throw in one last question around this business of commemoration and history. You'd probably be living under a rock if you did not know that in certain schools around the country, history, such as what we've heard today that Cody shared with us, and history such as what Courtney has talked about Sundown Town, some of this history has been considered inappropriate, that it should not be taught, that it's harmful, that it causes people to feel uncomfortable, it causes some of us who feel that we're being attacked. So here we are today talking about a very painful and very very traumatic incident in our town, my hometown's history. So here we sit and here we think. And I'm going to ask Courtney and Cody, why do you think the schools need this? Why do you think this business of banning certain books or banning certain pieces of history may actually be problematic?
I should preface this by saying I think a lot of the challenges of getting the books in the curriculum are often the tack taken to try to get them in as well. But I also realize that white privilege also played a role in getting the books in the curriculum too. But I think it's important if you go into a community that's maybe bucolic or country, and speaks in those kind of folksy, down-to-earth terms, to not use abstruse messaging like critical race theory. So, for instance, instead of saying critical race theory, you would say, let's put black history in curriculums, or let's put black literature like Langston Hughes in curriculums. The end result of getting it in the curriculums is the same, which is that the students engage those perspectives and topics and then grow from them. It's just that the term itself, critical race theory, I think has been misrepresented and demonized, and since it's so abstruse and difficult to understand, even when people ask me what it means, I have a difficult time explaining it. You're going to have a lot more success if you just use those very down-to-earth terms when you go to a superintendent. That's what I did. I said, this is a Black history book. Students are going to benefit from reading it. Now that may seem a lot easier, but I think if they take that approach. But to answer your question about how the impact that it's had, I've read the essays in the Johnstown Tribune Democrat from both Black and white students, and I think there's about 3 years now worth, and hopefully it stays in the curriculums in places like Ferndale and Windber, and all these students will come to realize that you can't let politicians like Calvin run this country or run elsewhere, or let these types of values govern their own lives, or, as James Baldwin says, to be cognizant of the history that affects our interactions with people of other races.
Well, my mother, you won't change until it hurts too much. And that's been said over many crying sessions with my mom, but related to this, if you don't know the hard part, what are you going to change? If everything's a fairy tale and everything is, and they lived happily ever after, and our town has always been perfect, and we have always welcomed everyone, and no, the Klan did not burn crosses on hills. Of course, our town is always perfect, but if you live here and you see it, and you feel it, and you know it, and your grandmother knows it, I want all students to understand that no, America is not perfect. It is soaked in blood, but it is also soaked in love. It is soaked in ingenuity. And if you're alive right now, you need to know what happened 100 years ago, so you won't let it happen again, your children won't let it happen again, and your grandchildren won't. So it may be an uphill climb to get stories like this and historical events like this in schools, but it has to happen. We cannot have an ignorant generation of voters. We cannot have an ignorant generation of politicians. We cannot afford it. So if it's hard, let's do it. Let's do the work. Let's teach the children. I'm 41 years old. I'm not in anybody's high school classroom, but my children will be, my nieces and nephews. So we must do that work, and we must not shy away from those heroes and heroines and even villains of our history so we can be better.
Well, I'll claim her as my niece. I want to thank Cody and I want to thank Courtney both today for participating in the panel. We're going to move to the next part of our program, so I'm going to give this back. For questions, we're going to have to answer questions and answers. Cody is going to be doing a book signing. And I know many of you want to get a book signed, or if you don't want to have a book or you don't want to get a book signed, you'll have a chance to come to the table and ask your questions personally to him. So that's how we're going to handle that. But right now, we have some other pieces of business to attend to. So I'm going to give the mic back to this gentleman.
I don't